first view is children need to be taught obedience. We've got to break their will. We've got to teach them to obey. And that's the kind of concept of reflexive obedience. Don't argue with me. I'm your parent. Do it. Okay. The other view is, let's understand why you want to do this thing, why it's wrong. Let's try to help you understand why it's wrong, and you make a decision whether you should do something that's wrong or not. Okay? And those are two opposite views. Unfortunately, in the 40s and 50s, this latter view, this view of children being born with potential for goodness, went a little too far in terms of permissiveness and assumed that children didn't need guidance. I think we've come kind of to the middle now in psychology, and we understand that children need guidance. Children will test limits. Children will try to get things that they want. But basically, parents should understand how to mold them into more moral children who really believe what's, in doing what's appropriate and what's not appropriate.
Everyone's agreed that, just about everyone, that there's nothing especially wrong with spanking young children. Of course, I don't agree with that. I think there is a lot wrong, but the general public doesn't find that. 2/3 at least of the population feels that it's even sometimes necessary. You can see the change from surveys of public attitudes about spanking. In 1995, we did a survey of a nationally representative sample of 1,000 American parents of children from birth through 17. And 65% of them, when they were asked, all these 1,000 parents were asked, do you agree or disagree that it's sometimes necessary to give a child a good, hard spanking? 65% agreed. That's a lot, 2/3. But when you compare it to only a generation ago, 1968, when that identical question was asked of another national sample for the first time, it was 94%. In other words, unanimity. There's hardly anything else about bringing up children that 94% of the population would agree on about modes of caring for children, except feeding and clothing. So we've gone from almost unanimity, 94%, to 65% in just one generation. That's, in historical context, lightning fast change, even though it's still 2/3. And when it comes to hitting kids with objects, there's a decreasing proportion of people who accept these traditional practices. I tend to classify, even though it's still legal, hitting a child with a belt or hairbrush as beyond ordinary corporal punishment, as child abuse. On the other hand, the difficulty with that is that in 1995, 28% of parents of children 9 to 12 hit the child with an object like a belt or hairbrush or paddle in that year. So this is, even though it's decreasing, a generation ago it would have not been 28%, it would have been at least double that, 60, 70% a generation or two. One of the most difficult issues about corporal punishment is to what extent it applies cross-culturally in different countries and among different ethnic groups in the United States. And I'd have to say the final answer isn't yet in. We need a lot more research on this. But what research there is overwhelmingly shows that this is just about a cross-cultural universal. Now, among African Americans, you find that's the part of the population where you get the strongest, one of the parts of the population where you get the strongest defense of corporal punishment. They say, well, given the tough life circumstances, kids have to learn how to give and take it. I think that's a prescription for disaster, actually prescription for death in many cases. African Americans sometimes also argue that it's part of their cultural tradition. Well, if you want to start their cultural tradition with slavery, then it is. Slaves maybe had to learn to be immediately obedient so as not to cross the master. But I think there's not very good evidence one way or the other on that issue.
Persecution against children and discrimination against children seem to be invisible sometimes. So we just aren't aware of them. And yet when you stand back and look at the history of the treatment of children, you see a tremendous amount of very clear-cut persecution, which undercuts our desire to think of children's lives as simple and happy and without any kind of clouds on the horizon. In fact, children have suffered a great deal throughout our history. I, as a parent, probably like many other parents, have smacked a child, used physical violence, but I know it's wrong, and I think that we as a society have to be clear that violence is not the way. When a judge has been raised to believe that corporal punishment is perfectly appropriate, it's very difficult for that judge to draw a line between the well-meaning, bad-tempered smack on the bottom and something that really rises to the level of serious abuse.